atrocities being committed by his regime.
Williams described all manner of crimes: soldiers burning down villages, in chains for minor offenses, women being kidnapped and forced into sex work.
While Williams was still traveling around Africa, the letter was published as a pamphlet and widely distributed in Europe and the United States. Leopold, of course, quickly marshaled his resources to fight back against the accusations.
Unfortunately, Williams had given Leopold some ammunition. In the full title of the letter, Williams referred to himself as a colonel of the United States Army. Though he was a former soldier, he hadn't made the rank of colonel, which made it easier for Leopold to discredit him.
Still, many newspapers took Williams' testimony seriously. One Belgian newspaper wrote that a personal, absolute, and uncontrolled regime whose chief autocrat has never set foot in the country he is governing is fatally bound to produce the majority of grave deeds pointed out by the American traveler.
Williams would have continued his attempts to expose Leopold's crimes to the world, but as he completed his circuit around Africa, he fell ill with tuberculosis. In August 1891, he died at the age of 41.
Had Williams survived, he would have seen conditions in the Congo become even more hellish. Over the next few years, the violence, oppression, and misery increased.
And it was all thanks to a new resource: rubber.
A rubber boom began in the early 1890s because of industrial demands for tires, hoses, and insulation. Unfortunately for the Congo's inhabitants, much of the colony was covered in rubber trees. By the late 1890s, rubber had overtaken ivory as the most profitable commodity extracted from the Congo.
Collecting rubber was difficult, painful work which had to be performed over a wide area, making it virtually impossible for Leopold's agents to manage the work directly. In order to compel locals to harvest rubber for them, Leopold's men would kidnap people from villages, typically women, children, or elders, and hold them hostage until a quota was met.
Those who didn't work fast enough were often killed in order to scare the survivors into working harder. To prove to Leopold's agents that the punishment had been carried out, the victims' severed hand collected as proof.
Leopold's force publique was compelled to carry out the dirty work. After the Europeans complained that the soldiers were wasting too many bullets on their executions, the FP started hacking off the hands of men who were still alive.
But while severed hands became one of the more infamous and memorable punishments, it certainly wasn't the only way to motivate the Congolese to meet their rubber quotas.
According to historian Theo Aronson, villages were burned, men flogged, women mutilated, children chained in sheds as hostages or flung into crocodile-infested rivers, whole clans wiped out. Tribes fled in terror across the borders. Those who survived lived a nightmare existence.
The exact number of people who died under Leopold's Congo regime is impossible to determine for certain. A conservative estimate is that between 1896 and 1906, the population of the Congo dropped by 3 million.
However, the consensus among most historians is that the number of deaths is probably closer to 10 million, or about half the population.
The king's personality only exacerbated the already exploitative and racist conditions of colonialism.
In response to the criticism laid against him, historian Adam Hochschild suggests that the tone Leopold sounded was always of annoyance or self-pity, never of shame or guilt.
After seeing a newspaper with derision, he supposedly said, "Cut off hands? That's idiotic. I'd cut off all the rest of them, but not the hands. That's the one thing I need in the Congo."
As the violence in the Congo intensified, so too did criticism of Leopold and his regime. Many others picked up where George Washington Williams had left off. One was a Black American Presbyterian missionary missionary and reverend named William Shepherd.
Starting in 1890, Shepherd spent nearly 2 decades traveling throughout Africa, witnessing the many atrocities committed on Leopold's behalf. Unwilling to remain silent, Shepherd wrote about what he saw for missionary magazines, inspiring others to take a closer look at the Congo.
But perhaps the most consequential person to challenge King Leopold was a young clerk for the Elder Dempster Lines shipping company named Edmund Denny Morel. And at some point in the 1890s, the 20-something Morel stumbled upon the truth about Leopold's colony.
After seeing a report of large quantities of rifles and ammunition being shipped to the Congo, Morel began to wonder why war materials were needed in the colony. Even more concerning was the fact that these shipments were not on the official logs.
After confirming with his own eyes that the Elder Dempster ships were carrying weapons and ammunition, Morel decided to dig deeper. He then discovered that while massive amounts of ivory and rubber were being taken from the Congo, virtually nothing was being sent back to pay for it all. Thus, while Leopold was painting himself as an anti-slavery humanitarian, the king was, in effect, one of the world's largest slavers.
Morel went to his superiors and demanded that something be done. His bosses tried to get rid of him by offering him a promotion in another country, but Morel refused. He was then offered £200 a year in consulting fees, essentially a bribe for him to stay quiet. Again, Morel refused.
Finally, Morel had had enough. In 1901, he quit Elder Dempster and devoted his time to attacking the unimaginable barbarities being committed in the Congo Free State. He started his own journal and published hundreds of articles and 3 books throughout Europe.
As the criticism intensified, Leopold realized that there was finally a legitimate threat against his colonial claim. If he wanted to keep his iron grip over the Congo, he was going to have to marshal every resource at his disposal, or lose everything.
Coming up, Leopold struggles to hold on to his colony in the face of mounting international pressure. Now back to the story.
At the turn of the 20th century, Edmund Morel, a young employee of the Elder Dempster Shipping Company, had stumbled upon the horrors of King Leopold. After being rebuffed by his superiors, Morel dedicated his life to bringing down Leopold's reign of terror.
It's no revelation that human beings are often apathetic to the plight of distant, unknown people. Even today, in the age of information, it remains difficult to rouse ordinary, well-meaning folks from complacency.
But before television or the internet, when still photography was a new medium, convincing the world of what was happening in the Congo required tremendous time and effort. And while we have the benefit of hindsight, at the time, most Europeans and Americans would have received conflicting reports on what was really going on in Africa. Racism, of course, played a large part as well.
People like Edmund Morel and William Henry Shepherd had to work tirelessly for years to shape public opinion and make the truth known. Morel became a particularly nasty thorn in Leopold's side, frequently publishing leaked documents about the colony.
Morel also received first-hand accounts from British, American, and Swedish missionaries, as well as former Force Publique soldiers. These witnesses brought back official documents to publish in his journal, including photos of burnt villages, tortured locals, and mutilated children.
Another important contributor was a Nigerian man named Hezekiah Andrew Shanu, who had formerly recruited soldiers for the Force Publique. He even ran his own successful businesses in the Congo, owning a grocery store, tailor shop, and laundry.
Shanu risked a great deal to provide evidence to Morel. When Leopold's agents found out, they couldn't arrest Shanu because he was a British citizen. Instead, they harassed him and his businesses so relentlessly that he committed suicide.
Thanks to the work of Morel, Chanou, and many others, the world began to wake up to the truth about Leopold's Congo. In May 1903, the British Parliament unanimously passed a resolution lambasting Leopold for his monopoly in the Congo and demanding that the Congo Free State be governed with humanity.
After the Parliament vote, the British Foreign Office told one of their diplomats, Roger Casement, to travel into the Congo and send back reports.
Casement spent almost 4 months traveling around the Congo. He sent a barrage of dispatches about the atrocities he saw, viciously criticizing the colony's administration.
At the end of 1903, Casement returned to Europe to compile his report, which was published early the next year. Baffled by what Casement detailed and worried about diplomatic repercussions, the Foreign Office softened the report by removing all the names and replacing them with initials.
Frustrated, Casement turned to Morel. Together, they created the Congo Reform Association. By the time the association held its first meeting in March 1904, it had the support of British earls, viscounts, businessmen, and members of parliament.
Over the next few years, Morel and his supporters wrote tens of thousands of letters. Important, too, were the mass meetings calling on the government to intervene in the Congo.
Even the American humorist Mark Twain threw his hat into the ring, publishing King Leopold's Soliloquy in 1905. The pamphlet raked Leopold over the coals, and all the proceeds went to the Congo Reform Association.
Joining Twain in speaking out against Leopold was educator and reformer Booker T. Washington. Washington led a delegation of Black Baptists to President Theodore Roosevelt and lobbied for the U.S. government to take action.
As Morel's crusade began to catch steam, Leopold reacted by pretending to be just as shocked and dismayed as everyone else.
Leopold also launched his own media blitz. In friendly newspapers, he tried to assert that he was no worse than the British. When that didn't work, he claimed that the accusations were all slander and lies. He even sponsored his own writers to travel to the Congo and see for themselves.
One of those writers, Mary French Sheldon, was taken on company steamboats and only permitted to see what the regime wanted her to see. The authorities went so far as to demolish a prison and move the prisoners before Sheldon passed by.
Leopold also attempted to hire American lobbyists to try and influence the U.S.'s response. Unfortunately for Leopold, this backfired.
That's how they need
After
to
a
measure
payroll dispute, one of his hired hands, Colonel Henry I. Kowalski, became frustrated. In retaliation, he sold his correspondence with Leopold to newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst.
The expose detailed how Leopold had not only bribed Kowalski, but also a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Once the story broke, there was outrage across America. Finally, U.S. politicians decided to join the British to make Leopold end his tyrannical reign in the Congo.
Leopold could no longer deceive the world as easily as he had years earlier, and he had himself to blame for that. Beyond the Congo atrocities, Leopold had a reputation as one of the most scandalous royals in Europe.
When he was 65, Leopold began an affair with a 16-year-old sex worker named Caroline Lacroix, who the press referred to as the Queen of the Congo. Leopold put little or no effort into hiding the affair.
Newspapers in Europe and beyond disparaged, while his fellow heads of state were disgusted. President Theodore Roosevelt refused to allow Leopold to attend the St. Louis World's Fair, calling him a dissolute old rake.
And while Leopold was burning bridges with heads of state, he was doing as much damage to his own family as possible. He threw his eldest daughter into an asylum when she ran off with a man who wasn't her husband, and subsequently racked up large debts.
When Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph suggested that Leopold ought to pay off his daughter's debts, as far as I'm concerned, my daughter is dead.
Meanwhile, when Leopold's middle daughter remarried against his wishes after she had been widowed, Leopold refused to speak to her ever again.
What do you think was
Even worse, he barred her from attending her mother's funeral.
At one point, two of the daughters joined forces and attempted to sue Leopold for their inheritance. Unfortunately, they lost.
Suffice it to say that even before stories of the Congo splashed across newspapers, Leopold's reputation was nothing short of diabolical. For the public, believing that Leopold was guilty of atrocities in the Congo Free State was all too easy.
Even though the Belgian government was poised to inherit the colony on Leopold's death, it became clear that Parliament would have to take control of the Congo sooner rather than later. Something needed to be done.
But Leopold wasn't about to let go of his colony for free. Before he would hand over the Congo, he forced the Belgian parliament to complete, at its own expense, the public building projects he had begun in Belgium. And, as one last twist of the knife, Leopold demanded and received an additional 2 million francs as a mark of national gratitude.
Parliament acquiesced. On November 15, 1908, King Leopold's control over the Congo came to an end.
A year after relinquishing control of the Congo, Leopold suffered from an intestinal blockage. On his deathbed, he married his young mistress, Caroline Lacroix. When his daughters came to Brussels to reconcile with him, Leopold turned them away.
On December 17, 1909, 74-year-old King Leopold II died. At the time of his death, Leopold was so despised that his funeral cortege was booed by crowds of Belgians.
It's difficult to determine just how much wealth Leopold took from the Congo, as he avoided announcing his profits. In fact, he usually insisted that he made no money at all from the colony.
One estimate suggests that between 1896 and 1906, the king may have made 3 million pounds sterling, which is equivalent to 15 million US dollars at the time.
Now that Leopold was finally gone, many hoped that suffering in the Congo would come to an end. While the worst atrocities did diminish under Belgian administration, the system of forced labor, heavy taxation, hostage-taking, and brutal punishments remained.
The Belgian Congo lasted until 1960, when the colony finally achieved independence, renaming itself the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Unfortunately, despite their newfound autonomy, the area never recovered from Leopold's rule. And to this day, the nation continues to struggle with political, social, and economic turmoil.
Meanwhile, in Belgium, Leopold II's legacy remains controversial. The nation, particularly the capital of Brussels, is still adorned with public buildings erected by Leopold, paid for with wealth plundered from the Congo at the cost of millions of lives.
However, in 2020, Belgians started a petition to remove all statues of Leopold from Brussels. Those who put together the petition stated, "We do not want to erase the past. We do want to erase any homage to this man."
In June 2020, for the first time, a Belgian monarch expressed remorse for the country's colonial rule. Some, however, criticized King Philippe for falling short of a full apology.
Of course, not everyone in the family expresses remorse. The king's brother, Prince Laurent, said
Yeah, but their
in an
beaches
interview,
suck so much dick.
Leopold II
Their beaches
never
are
went
like
to the
fucking
court himself.
beaches.
I do not see
Where's
how
the
he
nicest
could have
beaches?
made people there suffer.
Florida?
Over
Really,
100
it's
years
down.
later,
Or Hawaii.
there's still a disconnect
But
between
not
the royal
LA.
family and the Congolese lives destroyed because
The
of their
people are better looking
ancestors.
than in Florida and Hawaii.
For Belgium
But the
and for the
beaches
Congo,
too cool.
the scars of Leopold's reign
It's the
may
water's
never
cool. You can have a. Have you swam in the water? Yeah. Just for a second.
Thanks for listening to Dictators.
I was.
Next week, we move to Austria-Hungary and explore the long reign of Emperor Franz Josef. Among the many sources we used, we found The Coburgs of Belgium by Theo Aronson and King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild extremely helpful to our research.
Cool, man.
You can find all episodes of Dictators and all other Spotify originals from Parcast for free on Spotify.
Oh,
We'll see you next time.
Dictators is a Spotify
It's really
original
big
from
for me
Parcast. It is executive produced by Max
to be able to
Cutler.
put my hand in
Sound
an ocean.
designed by Dick Schroeder with
Why?
production assistance by Ron Shapiro, Trent
Not everybody's
Williamson,
touched both
Carly
oceans.
Madden,
And
and
there are
Isabella
like 5.
Way. This episode of Dictators was written by Devin Hughes, with
There's
writing
the
assistance by
Arctic,
Kate Gallagher and Joe
Indian.
Guerra, fact-checking by Adriana
They did
Romero,
Antarctic
and
stuff.
research by Bradley Klein. Dictators stars
Pacific and
Kate
Atlantic.
Leonard and
And I
Richard
touched
Rossner.
the Pacific and the Atlantic. Really? Yeah. When?
Hey there, Carter again. As we close out, here's a reminder to check out my new Parcast limited
Most
series,
recently, I was in South Carolina, and I
For
touched
10 weeks,
the Atlantic.
we're exposing
But
the
before
men
then,
who were far more flawed than fatherly, ruining
we
anyone
swam in
who
the
stood
ocean,
in their
I
way,
believe.
even their own families. Follow
I've
Devious
seen it.
Dads free
We swam
only
in the
on
ocean one
Spotify.
day when we were on vacation. I took a week off. Really? Yeah. Is it the biggest trip you guys ever took to
Outside the Italian city of Verona,
Why?
cannonballs cut across the sky as two armies exchanged
We went
fire
to,
near the village of Santa Lucia.
Just behind the front lines, the
tour guide,
17-year-old Austrian colonel looked on approvingly as his battalion surged through a cloud of rifle smoke, swiftly
high
overwhelming the much
tickets,
larger
how
Italian
to.
This
squadron.
We
wasn't
had friends
any
who rented a
ordinary
house down
young
there,
officer, but
so we stayed with them.
Archduke Franz
We stayed in
Joseph,
Tampa. We
second
stayed
in line to the throne of Austria.
The Italians
Orlando.
were fighting for independence from the
stayed
Austrian Empire, and Franz
I
Josef
think we
was
spent
there
a
to
day.
help squash the revolution. But his presence was also a ploy to help grease the wheels of his ascent to the throne.
West Coast in,
The
where, did you
Austrian
make the Miami?
commander watched as a cannonball landed a few paces away from Franz Josef. Young
My parents have just
Archduke
been there,
merely
like
flinched.
recently, a
The
few times.
commander smiled,
So,
perceiving
it
what the boy's mother had long seen in him, a brave, headstrong young man born to lead.
Have I been
That
to?
evening, Franz Josef wrote home
Anyway,
to his mother, bragging that he was overjoyed to hear the whistle of the cannon
We're
fire.
pretty close.
He also praised the harsh discipline from the officers, writing merrily,
And what?
"Here, whoever does not do as
Yeah,
he
so I
is
was in
told
South Carolina,
is
and
arrested
my
and
friend,
severely
I just put
punished,
my hand in the
and
water.
be he a
Was it
prince
cold? It
or a
was December.
priest."
By the end of
And
that
was the
year,
water
the
cold?
young man would be
Um,
putting his authoritarian impulses to work,
It
beginning
was like
his
it's about
nearly
a year now,
70-year
or like
reign as Emperor of Austria. A reign that would
It
mark
wasn't
not only the collapse of the Habsburg
freezing,
dynasty,
but I don't know if I
but the
was.
crumbling
It was
of the
warmer,
old
but I mean in
European
Florida it's a
order.
lot warmer down there. Then what? Especially on the Gulf side. Really? Why? Because the water just heats up all the fucking time. And
Welcome
it's
to
just
Dictators,
water
a
all the time.
Spotify original from Parcast. I'm Richard.
And I'm Kate. On this show, we're going deep into
Florida
the
and
minds of
Caribbean
some
are
of
really
history's
nice,
most
but you
hated
need money to be able to
despots.
do it. And I'm not talking
This
Florida
season,
money.
we're
I'm talking
exploring the
international
lives
money.
of three
What does that
despot
mean?
monarchs who ruled in the decades leading up to the First World War. King Leopold II of
When-
Belgium, Emperor Franz Josef I of Austria-Hungary,
Like
and
if
the
you
three
have a
pashas of
lot
the
of
Ottoman
influence,
Empire.
a
You
lot
can find all episodes of Dictators and all
Florida?
other Spotify
You're
originals
like a
from
yacht?
Parcast for
yacht docks when
Today,
there's
we're diving into
a
the
hurricane
rise of
coming.
Emperor
You can take that
Franz
thing up the
Josef
coast.
I. We'll track his upbringing as a scion of the Habsburg dynasty and
Get
his
out of the
mother's
way.
efforts
You can
to
take it
install
out to the
him as the
ocean.
ruler of Austria.
You have
We'll
people who you
also
can
look at
perhaps
the young
pay to
emperor's
like take care of your
violent
stuff.
early years and the
When
measures
it
he
comes to
took
a house,
secure
and
power.
if you have one of those big
we'll
fucking
explore how Franz
condos
Josef brought Austria and Hungary
high
together in a
up in
dual
like
monarchy with himself
this game
as the
big
head
and
of
shit
both.
of Florida,
We'll also
you don't have to really
chronicle the
fucking worry.
devastating personal losses that marked his later life and see how his decisions triggered the bloodiest conflict in human history.
And then you
All
don't
of that
ever,
and more is coming
whenever
up.
you hear that there's a
Stay with
hurricane
us.
coming, you leave. And that's when Florida's nice. Then you only, it's still
Franz
not
Josef
that nice.
I was the
Really,
last
yeah. I mean,
monarch of
in
the
comparison to
Habsburg
California,
dynasty.
Florida's still
noble
sucks.
lineage
Even
that
without
had ruled the
hurricanes.
Holy Roman
Really?
Empire for over 3
Even without
centuries.
hurricanes, Florida has
During
fucking
his long
alligators
reign,
and
the
crocodiles.
longest in
And
European
that kind of
history,
shit you just don't
he
about
led
which
this
you don't have to worry
enduring
about.
empire
Really?
into the modern era.
Unlike some of the
I don't
rulers
worry about
profiled on our
rattlesnakes.
show,
I don't worry
Franz
about
Josef wasn't a
anything.
bloodthirsty tyrant who
Why?
committed mass atrocities
If
or
I lived out
Machiavellian
in Inland
villains
Empire,
scheming
maybe I might
and
think about
clawing
a
his way to
rattlesnake every
power.
once in a while.
Nor was
But
he a fervent nationalist like the 20th century despots
I'm
who would
certainly
emerge
not
a
worried about
generation after him.
crocodiles. I'm certainly
Instead,
not worried
there were
about
two driving
alligators.
forces
I'm certainly
behind
not
Franz
worried
Josef's
about
rule. The first was a desire to unify and stabilize the empire, expressed in his motto, Viribus
the mosquitoes
Unitis,
there.
with
They're
united
fucking
forces.
The second
Jurassic
was an
size in comparison.
unquestioning
These
belief
sucks, like
in the
those.
divine right of kings. The doctrine
What else
that
do we have
his
there?
rule was the direct decree of God.
As his old-fashioned values might suggest, Franz Josef was averse to modernity in all its forms.
It's not.
He avoided new technology like telephones and elevators.
Why
He
is
even
Florida
demanded
Man
that
a big
documents
deal?
be written out in longhand rather than typed.
When
Florida Man
Theodore
is like
Roosevelt
Karen.
visited Franz
This
Josef
thing
in
that's come up in the
1910,
last
the
like
monarch declared,
10 years.
"You see in me
And
the
it was
last
invented
European
basically by
monarch of
Californians.
the old school."
Florida Man.
He
Why?
knew that he
You gotta shit on
represented an
somebody,
old guard
and,
that was in constant conflict with the modern world. And no matter
Florida's the
how
number 2
long
best
he
state. There's no
reigned,
doubt about that. So it's like
modernity
we always
would
shit on
triumph in the
Of course,
end.
of course, of course. But then Florida has a
Before
different
his
kind of
fight
law than
against
most states
modernity
where
and progress,
if
Franz
something goes
Josef's
wrong,
young
they
life
publish
was
it right away.
dominated outsized
A lot of other
influence of
states
his
not
mother, the
necessarily that
Archduchess
quickly
Sophie.
that they do that. So a lot of shit
Strong-willed
they
and
get out. But
ambitious,
also people do
observers
crazy shit
joked
for
that
it.
Sophie was
Why?
the only man at court.
Well, it's like the end.
Early in her
It's
marriage,
at
Sophie had expected her
a very
husband,
important place in the
Archduke
world.
Franz
It's
Karl,
like the Gulf,
to be named
and
emperor in place of his older
but
brother,
like people don't know this.
Ferdinand.
You can get
Likely
from Miami to
resulting from
Chicago
inbreeding,
if you really want
Ferdinand
it.
lived with
2 different
numerous
ways. You
physical
can get
and
through
mental conditions,
through
including
the
epilepsy, speech
well,
problems,
not
and
using
difficulty
land. You
moving
could of course
about on
drive
his
it
own.
much as
But certain
or fly.
factions in the
But
government
you could
encouraged
go there by
Ferdinand
the
to
Atlantic
claim
Ocean
his
through the St.
rightful
Lawrence
place
Seaway,
as first in
or the
line to
Gulf
the
of Mexico
throne.
through the
Archduchess
Mississippi River.
Sophie
It's really
never
a
got
key
over
point
the
of the world,
disappointment
Chicago.
of her husband
Miami is as well.
and
I wouldn't
herself
say it's on the
being
dick of
passed
the
over.
United States.
So she ensured
Really?
that if she couldn't be the wife of an
Rancho Palos
emperor,
Verdes is
she
the
would
foreskin
be the
of
mother of one.
California, and
Born in 1830 at the Palace of Schönbrunn, Franz Josef, or Franzi as his parents and siblings called him, was the first of 3 brothers and 2 sisters. As the oldest, Franzi was the next in the royal lineage after their father, since their infirm Uncle Ferdinand had no children.
As a boy, Franzi was thoughtful and quiet, an excellent dancer who loved wearing fine clothes. He had a comfortable, oddly normal childhood. His father played with the boys when he was home, read adventure stories to them in the evenings. But Franzi's parents, especially Sophie, were also intent on preparing him to lead.
From the age of 6, Franz Josef received a strict and
Really?
thorough education.
How you drown
He
in a
studied
fucking
for
bath?
upwards of 18
Who are
hours
you,
a
Jimi
week.
Hendrix?
By age
Come
11,
on.
he was spending well over 40
34
hours a
years
week
old?
with his lessons.
It was a
What
rigorous
34-year-old
course
man is
of
making a
rote
bath? And if
instruction
he
in
is, I'm that
history,
kind of guy. Cool.
literature,
I'm not drowning.
languages, military tactics, and science. The aim was
Why?
to equip him with knowledge and skills that would make him an effective ruler. But the
Well, I
strict
mean, like a
upbringing
bath is like
may
this
account
deep.
for
I
some
don't know what
this
happened.
and inflexibility.
I would just be like, Nick
It
Carter,
was during
I don't know
this
what the fuck
time
happened to
that
your
young
brother,
Franz Josef developed an unshakable faith in Catholicism.
but I think
The
it's
divine authority of the Catholic
Why?
Church was not to be
It was a big
questioned,
thing. He was a top.
and neither was the authority granted by the Church to the
Really?
Emperor.
Yeah.
As a child, Franzi loved playing with toy soldiers, watching sentries march, and dressing in costume uniforms. At age 13, the military games became real. Franzi was made Colonel-in-Chief of Austria's 3rd Dragoon Regiment. A year later, he was leading his battalion in training exercises.
Sophie was pleased at her son's progress. There was no doubt that he was prepared to lead.
And on the eve of Franzi's 18th year, discord was playing out on the streets of Vienna. A perfect opportunity for the Archduchess to exploit.
The year 1848 was marked by turmoil across Europe, and nowhere more than in the Austrian Empire. In the cities, workers decried the poverty brought on by the Industrial Revolution, while students cried out against the suppression of the press.
In the country, harvest caused unrest amid peasant farmers on feudal manors.
Ring.
They used their scythes as weapons against the soldiers sent to collect crops for the lords.
By the beginning of 1848, when Archduke Franz Josef was not yet 18, a revolutionary fervor had taken hold of the entire continent. As historian Anatole Murad put it, nation was pitted against nation, class against class, army and police against everybody in a
One time I
witch's
dated this
cauldron
girl
of conflicting tensions.
This was the
At
nicest
any
compliment I
moment,
could
the
give you.
lid would blow off.
Really?
The revolutionary kettle boil over.
Why?
One
That's how
uprising came in
rural I
Hungary, which had been under Austrian rule for decades.
Okay, so
The
she's a
locals
super
had long been
Democrat.
resentful
Super
of
big.
the empire's control.
Really? Yeah.
They wanted
And
a
what?
constitution that guaranteed
I mean, to a
them
point
a
where she
degree
led
of local sovereignty.
Democrat presidential
Emperor Ferdinand initially granted them an
candidate
independent ministry with its own
liberal.
set of laws and
That's pretty
reforms
fucking
still within the monarchy.
liberal.
But it was an agreement
And
made
she's
in
really into
bad faith.
environmentalism.
Soon
For her,
the
I
Croatian
think we
official,
ban in the United States fluorocarbons. One time, she wanted me, we're on the phone, and she's like, hey, is there any way you would call the person, like, she had a candidate who was, had like a political event in Southwest Lower Michigan.
Hungary was prepared for war. What they didn't
He was a
realize
unique
was that
candidate,
the Austrian
really.
Empire
He did all
would
these
soon
party
have a
lines
new
back in the day.
ruler,
I remember
one
that
who
about
had
him.
cut his teeth
And she
in
told me
battle
about party
and
lines,
was
which are like,
determined to
so
crush
this man
them,
was a man who didn't have a
whatever
sight.
it took.
Coming up, Franz Josef begins his reign as the streets run red in Vienna.
Hi, listeners. It's and my friend had a lot to do with his success. And while he didn't win, he did much better than
just in time for Father's Day. It's called Davius Dads, and it introduces you to some of the most feared, fraudulent, and fatal fathers in history. Every Sunday on Spotify, discover the men who started out as role models
we used to do all kinds of, we used to put out signs with him for him.
Like Wall Street financier Bernie Madoff, whose billion-dollar Ponzi scheme destroyed countless families, including his mom.
She really cared a lot.
Or Marvin Gaye Sr., whose envy and resentment towards his son's successful music career drove him to murder.
So I was starting to date girls who were like so hot that my friends found out about them in different areas, in a different state than before it was. And it was like, now her exes are like people that I know, and I know they've been to their house. They're really nice people. Like, I think highly of them. So and but she was so pretty. She was way prettier than anyone else. She was prettier.
Was steps closer to becoming fully autonomous. The Austrian government responded by moving troops into the surrounding regions.
A major confrontation loomed, one that threatened to open a huge rift in the center of the
all kinds of stuff. My big great grandma, I was on the 50-yard line of this Western Michigan football team.
But Hungary wasn't the only fault line in the empire's unity. In March of 1848, Austria's capital city of Vienna erupted in protest. Students, arm in arm with striking laborers, took to the streets to rally for reforms.
I read On the Road for her. She's like, I really like Jack. I really like
along with freedom of speech,
the Beat
religion,
Generation. I wasn't all that familiar with the Beat
the response from those
Why?
in power
Because it's like a lost generation. It's very quiet, but it's Jack Kerouac, and it's like On the Road, and it's very, it's a generation of the 50s. It's like
was
quiet
riding
jazz,
through the crowd when a piece of wood thrown by a protester struck him in the head. Incensed, Albrecht ordered an artillery outpost to fire on the crowd.
When the sergeant in charge refused
one of the
to
first,
carry out the order, the Archduke commanded his soldiers to march into the
one of the
crowd,
first
assaulting the protesters with bayonets and the butts of their rifles.
movements.
Emperor Ferdinand denounced the
Why?
attack
Because it was
and
just
offered
like
to make concessions to appease the
there were
protesters.
drugs involved,
He even
perhaps,
floated the
and there just
possibility
were a
of
lot of
drafting
things
a
that weren't.
constitution.
Appearing in
So
the
then what?
streets, the emperor was greeted with cheers
She
from
was
the
really
people,
into it,
but his
and she was
conciliatory
like,
proposals
"But I'm
weren't
looking
enough,
for
and the
a very
protests
specific
raged on
version
for
of On
months.
the Road."
Karl
She's like, "I want
Marx,
to use it,
fresh off
and I want a
publishing the
version that
Communist
someone has read,
Manifesto,
and
even came to Vienna in
I want to
August
like
to warn the demonstrators
follow that."
against making concessions to the emperor. He left just in
So I
time
looked
to
all
avoid
over every
being
local
executed
bookstore
by the state.
copy
Conspicuously
Jack
absent
West
from
On the
Vienna
Road,
during this
and I
time
find one,
was 17-year-old Franz
and
Josef.
I go
While
downtown
many
and
of the
get it,
Habsburgs had
and
retreated to their
it's
country
in perfect
estates,
condition. It's used,
Archduchess
but it's
Sophie
like
saw an
it's
opportunity
like,
to
this is
exploit the
actually
chaos
she
for her son's
wants
advantage. Rather than have Franz
all
Josef
kinds of
watch the
fucking.
fray from the
Somebody got really
sidelines,
excited at this
Sophie
point, and
arranged for him to
so
serve on the front
I knew
lines.
what she wanted, kind of, I think, and so I,
In the
of
northern
course, a couple
Italian
days read it,
provinces,
like,
a series of
and
revolts sought to
did all
liberate the
that shit.
region from
Every time
Austrian
we're in
rule.
California, so I
Sophie
like,
reasoned that her son's bravery
was
on the battlefield would set the stage for him to succeed his uncle as emperor.
At the same time,
kind of
Sophie
sad.
didn't want her
You could tell
son's
I was not in
reputation
love
to
with
be
her.
tainted by the events in Vienna. She was
They
revolted equally by the
but I did,
audacity of the protesters and the tepid response from the
and I
feeble
would say I
Emperor
didn't read it as
Ferdinand.
well as I wanted to because I had
Franz
only like a
Josef's
week to read
distance from the
it,
city
and
would
I remember
also
at the end I'm just
distance
like
him
circling
from
at
the
the end.
Emperor's actions.
I was really into
Sophie
it.
was
I'm not
shrewd
saying I
enough to
wasn't into
perceive
it.
something critical about the current state of affairs. While the uprisings across the empire had some
I did
common
and
grievances, there was no coordination
but I did
among
give
the
it to her,
groups
and
and
so
no
she
clear,
but I remember
unified
telling her,
purpose.
The Austrian
"This is
Empire
how
was a
big it is.
patchwork of nations with
You are
no
so
prominent
pretty,
ethnic group, language, or culture.
Yeah. Why?
Serbs,
Those
Croats,
girls are pretty.
Germans, Slovaks, Hungarian,
But
Magyars,
she was
Poles, and Italians
she
were
was
all
so
among the
overly
diverse
black
population.
that it was like
Consequently,
they could
the
just cut off your
revolutions of
fucking head and
1848
replace that
were
fucking
regional,
lady in the morning,
with no
or that other fucking lady, or that
collaboration
other
between
fucking lady.
the
They could replace you
Italian
with any of
rebellion in the
those
western part
fucking
of the
ladies.
empire
Really,
and
yeah.
the Hungarian
And
uprising in the east.
and
Each
you
group was trying
now
to
she'd
win
be totally
local
different. She's a
sovereignty
liberal
rather
version
than
of that.
topple the empire.
But
As long as they were divided,
she was
the Austrian
that
forces
attractive
could
and
subdue
that well
them one by one.
basically.
Nonetheless, the various insurgencies struck at the empire with tremendous will and energy.
What
And
happened?
there were times when the Habsburgs' own soldiers identified more with
Well,
the
I didn't have a
insurgents
job. I
than
didn't have
with
a
their
job.
leaders.
I was trying to balance a job. I didn't have a
In
cell
the
phone.
fall
I
of
dated this girl. I didn't have a
1848,
cell phone.
the
I was calling her with her
War
phone.
ordered a
I mean, can you
delegation of
imagine
troops
girls
to join
texting a
battle
guy
in Hungary.
on his mom's
But
phone?
some of
I
the
had girls
troops
text me in college on my dad's phone. At least that was my dad's phone. This is my mom's phone.
A group
Oh,
of
right.
protesters dragged
But
the
she was really
minister
sweet,
from his
and
office. By evening, his body hung from a
I-
lamppost in a city square, naked and mutilated by stabbing.
my mom had this like
This
candy.
was the
I forget
final
what it
breaking
was.
point.
Chocolate phone.
In late October, the
White
new
phone.
Viennese field marshal,
She
Prince
gets hit by
Alfred
it.
Windisch Gratz, mounted an aggressive effort to end the uprising in the capital. He surrounded Vienna with troops
They used to
and
do this
laid
thing back in the
siege
day
to his
where
own
they'd make
city,
the phones smaller and
killing
smaller and smaller.
over
And small
2,000
phones were getting to be.
citizens in the
Well, the Razor
process.
was probably
Just
the
before
smallest
New
phone.
Year's, Windisch Gratz issued a proclamation amounting to state-ordered
Never forget where I
terrorism.
was when I fucking
The
saw it first.
document called for the
Advertising
immediate
where I was in
execution
fucking
of
Zom,
anyone taking orders from the
2B6 man.
Revolutionary Committee.
And
Any village that harbored revolutionaries
busy.
would be
Anyway,
leveled
I'm watching
to
the Super
ground,
Bowl in there.
and the village leaders
And
would
what?
pay with their heads for any disturbance.
Windisch Gratz's
What's the
forces
thing? So my
executed
friend,
over 2
they were
dozen
watching
people
Super Bowl, whatever. It's
suspected
when
of
the fucking
sedition.
New England
The
playing
city
playing
was under
Philadelphia.
strict military
And
control throughout the fall and winter.
It was against
my friend
this
Phil
bloody backdrop
is
that Franz Josef succeeded to the
a
throne
pretty
of the
big
Habsburg
ego fan.
dynasty.
Why? His dad's from Philadelphia.
That August,
So-
Franz Josef had turned 18,
And his friend,
and his mother was busy arranging the terms for a transfer of power.
And
Central to her plan was the support
I know
of Prince
Kyle
Felix Schwarzenberg,
anyway,
a brilliant
I
statesman
don't
and military strategist.
Schwarzenberg sought a more central role in the government, but he didn't wish to serve under Emperor Ferdinand.
was
The
also on
introduction of a
in the
new
dorm,
sovereign
and they had a
whose
bet.
reign he could help shape from the
Whatever
outset
person,
would allow
whatever-
him to better exert his influence. To this end, his interests aligned perfectly
remember
with the
King
Archduchess.
Schwarzenberg had met Franz
had to
Josef
shave
in
that head.
Italy and was impressed with the promise
So
the
it was
young
a big.
man
That's a
showed.
big fucking bet.
All they had to do
Why?
was get Emperor Ferdinand out of the
And
way.
it's different than today, where people are more. Why would I say today? Where okay. So somebody just got like a haircut. No, back then these kids both had very traditional haircuts, and it was like somebody's gonna be like
On
somebody.
December 2nd,
So
1848, Emperor Ferdinand handed power to his grandson in a quiet ceremony, attended only
we're
by
watching
the
this thing,
imperial
and I think
family
it was
and a
half
few state officials.
They have this
Franz
fucking.
Josef knelt before his uncle, and Ferdinand blessed him by making the sign of
They
the
have
cross
this
on
fucking
his head. He said to the new monarch,
commercial or
God bless you,
razor
Franzi. Be good. God protect you. I'm happy about it all.
And with that blessing, Franz Josef I rose as Emperor of the Austrian Empire.
Keeping both of his given names, Franz and Josef, was a deliberate choice. Franz was inherited from his grandfather, Holy Roman Emperor Franz II, and Josef was a nod to his great-granduncle, Emperor Joseph II, who was regarded as a
This thing
progressive
looked like a
reformer.
fucking razor. Like literally,
Joseph
it came
had
like
championed
it was like
religious
this.
tolerance
We
and
saw this phone and how fucking thin it was, and it was like cutting through shit, and we were like, "Oh my fucking god, that is the coolest fucking phone I've ever seen in my entire fucking life." And it's a flip phone, and it's like it goes right in your pocket. It's really fucking small. It's thin as fuck. It was like it was. I remember we all saw it in this fucking room, and we were all like, "Okay, we absolutely have that fucking phone." Why? All the other phones were like thick, and this one was so thin you could put it in your pocket. It was like almost in your wallet. You couldn't put it. It was very, very thin. And
would soon have their hopes
was it a good phone?
dashed.
Well, you had T5 texting, so that was the issue. It didn't have a keyboard. But was it a good phone? Oh my god, everybody had that phone. Anyone had that phone. And if you didn't have that phone, I would just say to you, what in the fuck were you? And I would just assume you either were too young, didn't have a phone, maybe couldn't afford it, or were like my friend who was anti that phone. Everybody had that phone and he was fucking anti that phone. And it was the iPhone before the iPhone, by far. Really? The Motorola Razr was a fucking piece of shit. And what happened?
Needed only to look at the counselors he kept close.
Why didn't
to know
it
his true
continue?
intentions?
Yeah.
Along with his mother Sophie, Franz Josef's closest advisors were Prince Schwarzenberg and the Field Marshals Radetzky and Windisch Gratz, all of whom were fiercely militaristic.
I had a red
Razor
razor
for this.
I remember I could get.
Legend has it
What
that
happened?
one time when Schwarzenberg was asked to consider showing mercy toward the rebels, he retorted, "Yes, it is a good idea, but we'll have a little hanging first."
These men's propensity for violence was
So
on
I
full
could not get a
display
cell
in
phone
the early
until I got
months of
into
Franz
the
Josef's reign.
Is that the deal?
They showered retribution on anyone who questioned their
That
leader's
can't be.
sovereignty.
Really?
Coming up, Franz Josef engages in his first military campaign as
That was
emperor
the deal.
and settles
I remember
into
the
his
first call I
role
made
as
was to
an
my friend Sarah.
autocrat. Now back to the story.
Really? First call I made. I was in corner 23 and I wrote with my dad.
At the start of his reign in
We just kind
December
of switched my
1848,
phone.
Franz Josef surrounded himself with a
So
trio
then
of hawkish advisors, making it clear that the young emperor meant to rule with an iron fist.
But the new year brought three
We went
immediate challenges to his authority. An
Well,
attempt by
so
lawmakers
a couple
in
years
Vienna
went
to
by,
draft a constitution, an
and
uprising in Italy, and a fierce resurgence of the
I think I
rebellion in
wanted a
Hungary.
phone.
True to their military pedigree, Franz Josef
But
and
back
his
then,
advisors met all three of his
it wasn't like
challenges
today
with
where it was like, oh, I
overwhelming
need a new phone, I need a new
At
phone.
the beginning
It
of
was like
1849,
phones didn't
a
advance that much. It made
parliamentary
calls,
council, the
maybe it
Reichstag,
texted,
gathered in
and a camera would have been the big thing. If it had a camera, that would have been. And I think that's what the difference was in the two phones. So I had this one
The
phone,
Reichstag
just like
was the
shit
country's
Samsung.
first
It was a good
elected
phone.
parliament.
Or was it
The
Samsung?
officials had already
The
begun
shit little
work on the new
Samsung, which was a good
constitution
phone.
before
Still in your pocket.
Franz
It didn't have a
Josef
screen
took
on
the
the
throne.
front. I always wanted
The
a screen on the
document
front.
was to
So I
be
could check
fashioned
it.
in the mold of the
But,
American and
so I was
French
a
constitutions,
And that was the thing. It
establishing
just status
full
symbol.
representative government,
Really?
stripping
People see
the
you have a
emperor of
phone,
his
they got a screen on the
unilateral
front. It was like a
and
more
ending
expensive
both
phone.
state,
In today's day and age,
religion,
people
and
judge you by
nobility.
your
The
fucking
Reichstag was stopped in its
everything but
tracks.
your phone too.
Franz Josef
And it's like,
instead introduced his own institution.
He ultimately
I don't know,
dissolved
just
the
be like a
Reichstag,
difference. Like,
and its members were
I have a
dismissed.
very old phone.
To make sure the lawmakers didn't rebel,
But it
the
was different.
military was
It was
then
like you
sent
could buy
in to
both kinds of
patrol
phones.
the
It didn't
area.
necessarily mean it
But
was old.
while the
It just
regime
mean it
was
was
willing to
expensive.
strong-arm
But
lawmakers in
it wasn't the
Premier
first phone I ever had.
Franz
The
Josef
first phone
and
I
his
ever had was
officers saved their most savage
Radio
treatment
Shack,
for
and
opponents in other parts
I
of the
begged and begged and
empire.
begged my mom.
On
And she's
March
like,
12th, following a
yeah, I mean, I
months-long
think it's about time
armistice,
to probably
the
have a
war
phone.
against
And
Austrian
my
rule
dad did not.
recommenced in
And
the
so
Italian
I,
city
with my
of
mom,
Novara.
kind of behind his
Field
back,
Marshal Radetzky
on her
returned
truck,
to Italy with a contingent of troops,
and he
crushing
found
the
out,
rebellion
and he
in
was really mad,
days. A
and
period of harsh retribution against the Italians followed, with
he made
massive
us take
fines
back.
imposed,
Really, yeah.
land seized,
Is it the one
and
thing your
an
mom ever did behind
estimated
his back? No, but
960
it was
people
like,
were
I remember,
executed.
she's like,
But the
we shouldn't be
defining
doing this.
conflict of Franz Josef's
I
first
remember
months
she's
on
like,
the throne
don't let
was
people
in
know you
Hungary.
have it.
And
But
on
she
that
wanted to be able to
front,
get a
the
hold of
new
me and read
emperor
it.
aimed to
And
crush the
I was
insurrection
getting
with
older.
such ferocity that no one would dare question
friends
his
had 'em.
authority.
And
In April of 1849, the Hungarian
And they were having
resistance
called
formed their
houses.
own revolutionary government
is that
and
done?
proclaimed that the Austrian emperor had been
No,
deposed.
but it was
Franz Josef
expensive. I
could have met
remember
this
it was like,
challenge with restraint, negotiating
I
with
bought
the
the
new
phone,
Hungarian
and it had the
government.
little screen on the
He
front,
could have
and I
made
was setting
good
it up.
his
And I remember
predecessor's
setting it up, and I
promise of a
bought all this stuff,
constitution
and it was like
for
hundreds of dollars that I
Instead,
didn't have.
he called on the
And
support of
I
Tsar
was like, I
Nicholas
don't know if
I
this is
of
the right
Russia.
purchase. Why?
The
Because then you have
Tsar
a phone and
feared
it
that
just
a
sits there and nobody
successful
calls it.
revolution in
And
Hungary
it's
might
not like
spark a
today where it's a
similar
fucking
uprising
computer
in
and all kinds of
Poland,
other shit. It just
which
sat
was
there.
then under
And it was
Russian
like, okay,
control.
I don't know if I can.
Franz
So
Josef
then
fanned
my
the
dad said
flames of the
to
Tsar's
my mom,
anxiety.
he's not
He
getting a
wrote
phone
to
until
Nicholas that only the glorious fraternity of their empires could
is that what it
save
was?
modern society from certain ruin.
Tsar Nicholas offered the full
It was I
support
had
of his
to have
military to
3-0
squash the
drive,
Hungarian
and I had
rebellion.
to get in
That
to get
summer,
to the
with the
university.
aid of
Goodbye.
100,000 Russian soldiers, Franz Josef's
And the
forces
cheapest phone.
resoundingly
He didn't buy me
defeated
a
the
phone.
Hungarian
It was a free
forces
phone,
near the
and I
city
think he
of
paid an extra
Timisoara.
$5.
Hungary was
But
once
that was
again
such a big deal.
firmly under
Really?
Austrian
Oh,
rule.
Jesus Christ.
Though the
Maybe
events
that was
had done
probably
nothing to cool Hungary's
4
hostility
years.
toward the
But
empire.
The
then I wanted
atrocities
text it. It's
committed
like,
by the Austrian leadership
and
after
all my
the
friends
war
could text, and I
only
couldn't text. It put me in
inflamed the resentment.
I mean, just imagine today
Especially
trying to date a guy,
incendiary
and
was
he's
an
like,
Austrian
you gotta
military
call his
Baron
mom and
Julius
text her.
von
And,
Hainau.
anyway,
Von Hainau was a
I-
veritable sadist
but I made it
who had
work
earned the
somehow.
nickname
Really?
the Beast of
Yeah, and it
Grecian
wasn't ever.
for his torment of men,
Well,
women, and
I'd be like,
children
people would call
during
my
his
dad.
time on
Okay,
the
so this is what
Italian
happened.
front.
I had a cell phone.
Von Hainau
No.
remained in
I had my
charge
dad's
of the
cell phone.
subdued
I would take out
Hungarian
at night. My dad
lands
didn't use cell
following his
phone at night.
army's victory.
He just used it for
The
business.
emperor
So
decreed that no executions be carried out
I
without
could
his express approval. But
take
by that
out
point,
his
the
cell
beast
phone
had
at night,
already been released.
which is great.
Despite
If I needed to
Franz
call someone
Josef's
or I got in
decree,
trouble, I
over
had a cell phone.
100 Hungarian
But then
soldiers
people
and
started saying,
officials
"Hey, what's your
were
number?" And I was
shot
like, "Well, I don't
or
have a
hanged.
phone, but I got my dad's phone." Well, okay, well, what's your number? Fine.
Attempts to
Then they'd
restrain
start.
his violent
Girls would call my
demands.
dad the next day and be like, "Hi, is Michael there?" And he's like, "Yeah, let's see."
No other European monarch in the entire
He's like,
19th
"Who's this?"
century signed more death warrants than Franz Josef I did following the Hungarian Revolution.
A particularly
Anyway, that would
scandalous
happen all the
incident
time.
was the execution of
Really?
Hungarian
Oh.
politician Lajos Batyány.
And on mail and shit,
Although he was
that's what I
technically
couldn't stand.
among the rebels,
I would be like,
Batyány had urged restraint
huge
and
is-
accommodation with the
I had to
empire.
differentiate my dad. And I
Many
had the
believed
exact same.
his life would
I
be
didn't
spared.
what
But they underestimated the resolve of the new emperor. At the urging of
numerals were on
Archduchess
it
Sophie,
because it was too confusing. The only way we'd be able to differentiate ourselves in any way was our
Joseph ordered the man's execution
birthday
by hanging.
and social
On
security
the
numbers.
eve
Everything
of
else.
the execution,
So
Batyány, with either a dull blade or penknife,
it was
attempted suicide.
when mail would come, I
Not
never
wishing
got
to
what
make
it
the
was.
wrong
He
kind of
always opened
spectacle
everything
by
because it had his
dragging the
name.
bleeding man
And
to
he
the
could legally
gallows,
do that, and I
the
hated it.
officer in command
And
shot him
so
instead.
Only to be
I
censured
started
for
going
not carrying out
third,
the
pissed
execution
him off
as ordered.
because then he couldn't open that stuff anymore.
With the
And,
Hungarian Revolution finally behind him, Franz Josef set
and
out
then he'd
to
say, "Oh, I
prove
just
that he
forgot.
could
I
affect
didn't see
change
it or
through
whatever."
diplomacy,
But a lot of,
as
I mean, I'm
well
not
as
saying
violence.
he always did. But
In
then they started opening my
1850,
stuff all the
he
time. And it
worked
really
with the
bothered
King
me.
of
Like, don't
Prussia
do that.
to negotiate a
and
territory dispute.
they just felt
King
this
Frederick
like
William
control.
IV had been making incursions into the Hesse region of Germany, sometimes erupting into
No, but
violent
she would be on Fox
squabbles
News
with
tonight, so she
Austrian
watched.
troops
So,
there.
yeah.
Fresh off his own empire's internal battles in Italy and Hungary, Franz Josef now
That was the
found
nicest
himself
compliment
at
you
the
could
brink
get.
of war with a
Why was it
formidable
that?
foreign power.
Why wasn't it
But the
CNN
young
or anything else?
emperor didn't blink
Fox
as he
played
went toe-to-toe
when they had
with
fucking
Russian
Richard Ailes
king,
there.
who
They
was
played up
35
that
years
fucking
his senior.
Against the
stunningly
protests of Franz
bright
Josef's
blonde girl,
advisors,
and
the two leaders
and just
agreed to work together
in
to plan what
in
future Germany would
fucking
have and
business
under
attire
whose control.
all day long, and they just kept
It
cycling
wasn't a
them
great
through
victory for
so
the
that like
Austrian
middle
Empire,
America was
but
just
it was a
got
shrewd bit of
comfortable with these
diplomacy.
fucking hot ladies on television.
It also allowed Franz Josef to
Give me the
demonstrate that he was not only a strong-willed commander, but also a competent
And
administrator.
why didn't
Emboldened
CNN
by his
such?
successes
It
in
was like
battle
there
and
are
at
only
the
so many
bargaining
things you can
table,
do in
Franz Josef began to
news.
display
Like
his
what are they?
legendary regal
Um,
demeanor.
You can have a really
Developed
diverse
the habit
cast,
of wearing his
which is
military
usually what
uniform in public
CNN does,
so much that he earned the nickname
versus Fox, which I find is just the hottest
in
hottest
reference to the color of his army pants.
the hottest
Franz
girls we can
Josef
find.
wanted to prove
And
not only that he could hold office as his
from like local
great-granduncle had done,
And
that he
that's
could
just what they do.
rule
I mean,
and
Roger
rule
Ailes
well
used to make these girls
without
spin
anyone's
around,
help
and
or interference.
so you were telling your friend
In
that she wanted to,
1851, at the
but
age
I
of
was just like,
21, he set
she
out
was
to
just
do just
real
that.
like
On New Year's Eve,
I'd go
Franz
out of
Josef
state.
issued his Sylvester Pact, which dissolved the constitution he'd made earlier. No longer would he be subject to advice or
Anyway.
oversight from Parliament. Franz Josef was
Was she a
without
house girl you've ever
question,
dated?
an
No, but
absolute
she was
His grip on the government would
She was a
only
girl who,
tighten the following year.
um,
In April 1852, Franz Josef's most
I didn't
trusted
think she was,
advisor,
but
Prince
she really
Felix
changed how I looked
Schwarzenberg,
at politics a
suffered a
lot. Not like,
stroke
oh, she changed my
and died.
political leanings.
The emperor was
To some extent,
distraught.
though, she did.
He
Why? I had to
agreed
take
that Schwarzenberg's
environmentalism
newly
seriously.
empty role as
I'm a
president of the
conservationist,
ministerial council
but
would go
I never,
unfulfilled.
I never met
Franz
someone who like
Josef
really,
would
really cared
possibly
badly
hope
about
to
like
find
no
another
chlorofluorocarbons
counselor
in the
who
world.
could
That was
trust
my fucking joke.
Schwarzenberg.
Oh, so
So
she's on this
he would
fucking
rely on
her
himself alone.
her politician
From that
is
day
taking
forth,
calls,
Franz
and
Josef
she
would
asked me to
serve
give
as
him
both the monarch
a softball
and effectively as his
question.
own
So he's on the
prime
radio
minister.
doing an interview. So
But
I call
wouldn't
into the radio
go
and I said,
unchallenged.
"What are your
On February 18th,
what is your position on
as Franz
chlorofluorocarbons?"
Josef was
CFC.
walking along the city walls,
And I asked,
a
she's like,
Hungarian
she's
tailor
like,
sprinted toward him
can you
with a
think of a
knife.
political question that
Seeing what was
not
about
too
to
one way or
happen,
the
a
other?
woman nearby
And I was
screamed.
like, cool.
The
And that was
emperor
just the first fucking question that
but
came out.
not
Because it's an
quickly
environmental
enough.
question, and
The
I always
attacker
thought it was such a
plunged
funny
his
thing when we
blade
could learn
into
about it.
Franz Josef's
Chlorofluorocarbons,
neck.
chlorofluorocarbons, chlorofluorocarbons,
The
CFCs.
emperor
They're putting
remained
an
under
ozone in
close
a whole
medical
ozone.
supervision for days. He
Chlorofluorocarbons.
was weak, having
What are
lost
they?
a
They're like the
significant amount of blood.
aerosol sprays,
Doctors feared
and
that he might lose his
no,
eyesight.
aerosol sprays are tight as fuck.
Almost
And they
immediately,
don't
Franz
really
Josef's brother
affect
Maximilian,
the
next in
ozone like
line
you
to
would
the
think.
throne, Vienna.
They aren't perhaps
It's
the
likely
nicest thing for the
Archduchess
environment.
Sophie had called him to come
And
to take
they were
over
easy
if Franz
things to
Josef's
ban,
health took a
and
turn
they're
for
like,
the worse.
you don't need
But
to use. There are
Summers
other things
didn't
you can use to use
materialize.
that
The
stuff.
emperor made a full
So,
recovery. And when he found
I
Maximilian
asked
waiting for
the
him,
question
he angrily
candidate,
sent his brother
what's your
away,
stance on
chastising
chlorofluorocarbons?
him
And
for leaving his post in Italy.
If
what is
Maximilian has a chance
you know,
to seize the throne from his sibling,
very
he
political
would be
answer.
sorely disappointed.
That
No mere assassination
for the
attempt would
environment,
undermine
doesn't
Franz
think that
Josef's rule.
necessarily
There
a
was
good
work
thing.
to be done.
Understands that
Resolute
local
young
businesses
emperor
have
was
to produce
eager to
what they
rise
need
to
to
the
produce,
challenge.
but maybe they should be able to do it
Although
more
the rebellions of
environmentally
the previous decade had been
fashionable
defeated, the
ways.
attempt on
Okay,
the
great.
emperor's
So
life
that was just a
showed that
question. Yeah, but I think they do
revolutionary
plan
fervor raged on in
one day.
Hungary.
In the coming years, Franz Josef would dedicate himself to unifying the empire under his absolute rule. But in doing so, he would sow the seeds of its collapse.
Plus,
Call first thing Monday morning. Again, it's going to be easier now because they're standing by and ready, but it costs you nothing now or Monday.
Thanks for listening to Dictators. Next week, we'll hear about Emperor Franz Josef's consolidation of Austria and Hungary into a dual monarchy and discover how this ruler was himself ruled by love.
For more information on Emperor Franz Josef I, among the many sources we used, we found Franz Josef I of Austria and his Empire by Anatole Murad and Emperor Francis Joseph by John van der Kiersta extremely helpful to our research.
You can find all episodes of Dictators and other Spotify originals from Parcast for free on Spotify. We'll see you next time.
Dictators is a Spotify original from Parcast. It is executive produced by Max Cutler, sound designed by Dick Schroeder, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro, Trent Williamson, Carly Mack, and Isabella Way. This episode of Dictators was written by Greg Mead, with writing assistance by Kate Gallagher, fact-checking by Adriana Romero, and research by Bradley Klein. Dictators stars Kate Leonard and Richard Rosner.
It already was, but it's like on the lake.
Hey there, Carter again.
What else?
As we close out, here's a reminder to check out my new Parcast limited series, Devious Dads. For 10 weeks, we're exposing the men who are far more flawed than fatherly, ruining anyone who stood in their way, even their own families. Follow Devious Dads free only on Spotify.
It was a cold February afternoon in Vienna. The choir singer's breath fogged as the strains of a funeral hymn filled the air. A small contingent of the royal family and their advisors watched as a group of soldiers marched slowly past, carrying a coffin.
Ahead of the soldiers strode
What did you like about her? I like a lot of things about her, but she did something that I thought was so cool. She did some really cool things. But what is that? I like colors, and she did as well. And she would paint her nails every single day as relaxation. And I thought that was so cool. And she was so good at it that it looked like she had a master. And
days earlier had taken his own life at a hunting lodge.
that was what she did to relax. She'd have stress and she would paint her nails. And I just thought that was a really unique thing to do, but I thought it was really cute. Really sad. And she also taught me to teach yoga. So we were talking about I teach her some things about TikTok, and she kind of knew some things about it, and then she was like, yeah, like frisbee. I didn't necessarily know what frisbee was from a girl's perspective. I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, for instance, like,
for the future of his empire as well. As the emperor's only son,
she's like, I don't go for frisbees. I'm like, okay, what do you mean? And she's like, if a guy is like,
Rudolph's untimely end was not only a personal tragedy, it heralded the approaching demise of the Habsburg dynasty.
I remember the example she did. She said, if a guy likes red nail polish, I won't wear red nail polish. Just because, like, if he tells me that, I won't wear it just because I don't want to be like I'm wearing it. I do what I want to do.
On this show, we're going deep into the minds of some of history's most hated despots.
And I'm the one
for the current 6 episodes, we're exploring the lives of 3 despot monarchs who ruled in the decades leading up to the First World War.
That's great.
King Leopold II
She's
of
also
Belgium,
like, it's not like I
Franz
won't
Josef
wear
I
it
of
Austria-Hungary,
but
she said some guys who would feel like
you can find all episodes of Dictators and all other Spotify originals from Parcast for free on Spotify.
I didn't want to fit there.
This is part 2 on Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Josef I. Last week we examined his youthful rise to power as he succeeded to the throne of Austria at the age of 18.
And I couldn't just be like,
we'll look at Franz Josef's decades-long reign, which was marked by poor policy decisions,
no
and
money.
A string of personal tragedies.
So what would I do? I take
and we'll see how his decisions as emperor
which I
triggered the First World War and heralded the collapse of his family's dynasty.
We weren't members or anything.
We'll
and there's
have
just
all
one
that
parking
and
spot
more
that I would,
coming
in
up.
which I would sit, and I would just sit there all the time. It was like my spot.
After succeeding to the throne in 1848 with the help of his mother, Franz Josef and his advisors quickly vanquished an array of threats to his power. He blocked an attempt by Parliament to introduce a democratic constitution, and the military squashed revolutions in the Austrian territories of northern Italy and Hungary.
After those early bloody months, in which thousands were killed in battle or executed for sedition, Franz Josef began a series of ambitious initiatives to move the empire forward.
His mode of governing came to be known as bureaucratic
private
absolutism.
security and all kinds of stuff.
While the ruler
They don't
had
have that.
absolute say over
They don't
all
have
decisions,
private security
he installed a massive network of officials
Where
to
it's
carry
like,
out the
What are
day-to-day
you doing
work.
here?
In the 1850s, the
You're not
government
supposed to be
employed
here.
as
Blah,
many
blah,
as
blah, blah. You could be there
50,000
all
civil
fucking summer,
servants,
park there
many
every
of
single
whom
day,
aimed to
and not know.
modernize the
I'm not saying
empire
give a shit. They thought
economically and
maybe
socially.
you worked there, but
They
they
hoped
wouldn't.
to grant additional rights,
You weren't
better
bothering
living
them.
conditions, and greater economic mobility to citizens.
But rather than agitating for democratic reforms, they saw the stability of the Habsburg dynasty as the best path to progress. A strong state could provide the material conditions to support individual freedom and fulfillment. So they worked diligently to keep the system running, never questioning the emperor's sovereignty.
The early successes of Franz Josef's government were extraordinary. In just a few years, the government built hundreds of miles of new rail and roads. The medieval walls around the capital city were demolished, replaced by Ringstrasse, a stately boulevard that still surrounds the city's inner district today.
Fueled by revenue from the growing industrial and financial sectors, Vienna became a modern cosmopolitan city filled with art, theater, and music.
And progress was not limited to industry and art. The feudal system was abolished, liberating millions of agricultural workers from serfdom and returning their ancestral lands.
Franz Josef's constitution declared legal equality and recognition for all ethnicities and nationalities. Every group in the diverse empire was free to cultivate its own language, culture, and national identity.
On almost every Joseph's early reign made good on the tradition of his namesake, the reforming emperor Joseph II.
But Franz Josef was not concerned with the freedom and contentment of the people. For him, the reforms were all part of a strategy to win their loyalty, with the end goal of shoring up his own power.
Franz Josef had come to the throne amidst massive upheavals and rebellions that threatened to tear the empire apart. His guiding principle was to do everything in his power not to let threats like that arise again.
The assassination attempt by a Hungarian nationalist in February 1853 was a reminder that even with peace restored and the economy booming, not everyone in the empire cared for Franz Josef. He could never let his guard down.
But if the emperor was obsessed with the stability and integrity of the state, his ever-enterprising mother was more concerned with their family's legacy.
Shaken by the attempt on her son's life, Sophie became increasingly eager for him to marry and produce an heir. In June 1853, she sent a letter to her sister, arranging for a meeting between the almost 23-year-old Franz Josef and his 19-year-old cousin, Helena.
When the cousins got together for tea that August, Helena found herself tongue-tied, and Franz Josef was unimpressed. His eyes turned instead to Helena's 15-year-old sister, Elizabeth.
Oblivious to the emperor's affections, Sissy, as she was known, chatted away but with some embarrassment since she knew her sister was the one who was supposed to become his empress. But Franz Josef was smitten. After the meal ended, he went on and on to his mother about Sissy's beauty.
Just a few days later, Franz Josef attended church with Sissy and her family. After the Mass, he asked for the priest's blessing, proclaiming that she would be his wife.
He didn't bother informing Sissy of their engagement prior to the announcement, but she didn't object and seemed fond of her fiancé, if not as love-struck as he was.
However, it was clear from the beginning that things would be somewhat tense between the Archduchess and her daughter-in-law. Sophie, for the most part, accepted the situation, but still found opportunities to criticize his son's new fiancée.
During their courtship, she told Franz Josef that his bride would be pretty, if only it weren't for her yellow teeth.
With the marriage scheduled for the following spring, Franz Josef returned to governing, and all too soon a crisis arose that had the potential to undermine the security he had been carefully tending.
In the summer of 1853, Russian forces had invaded and occupied an area that was a principality of the Ottoman Empire. That October, the Ottomans declared war on Russia, beginning the Crimean War. Soon, the United Kingdom, France, and Sardinia would join the war, allying themselves with the Ottomans.
With territories bordering both the Ottoman Empire and Russia, the Austrian Empire stood in a crucial tactical position. Franz Josef found himself at the center of a tug-of-war between the two sides. The Western Alliance appealed to him to ally with them.
But Tsar Nicholas had provided the winning blow for Austria during the Hungarian Revolution only 4 years earlier. Though some hoped he would come to the aid of the more modern Western states, most observers expected the emperor to show loyalty to his benefactor.
But Franz Josef surprised everyone by making the worst decision possible. He initially refused to back Russia, offering to provide access and troops to the Western Alliance.
Tsar Nicholas was devastated. He had viewed Franz Josef almost as a son.
But when the time came for Franz Josef to make good on his promise to France, Britain, and the Ottomans, he reneged. Instead, he suddenly announced that Austria would remain neutral.
The jilted leaders were furious. It was a slight that Napoleon III of France, in particular, would not forget.
Had Franz Josef come to Russia's aid, the two countries might have emerged from the conflict as the most formidable military alliance on the continent. Conversely, had he followed through on his support for the opposing side, he would have won friends in the economically advanced countries of Western Europe.
Instead, he won nothing. By his act of bad faith and bungled strategy, Franz Josef left Austria without meaningful allies, alone on the world stage.
But he wasn't so lonely back home in Vienna. Franz Josef married his cousin Sissy on April 24th, 1854, a few months after her 16th birthday. Sadly, the new empress found herself immediately troubled by her station.
Much of her unhappiness was owed to her new mother-in-law, who hovered over the couple's affairs. For several days after the ceremony, the couple didn't consummate their marriage.
Sophie needled her daughter-in-law endlessly about her conduct at court. The Habsburgs were a family that very much stood on ceremony. Uncouth Sissy, who hadn't been trained as rigorously on decorum, proved to be an embarrassment.
Once, during a state dinner, Sissy thoughtlessly removed her gloves at the table. When an elderly noblewoman pointed out that this was not the custom, Sissy insisted that if the empress does it, then it ought to become the custom.
But her mother-in-law's displeasure focused mainly on Sissy's ability to produce an heir. Sophie pestered the teenager about having children, and when they did finally arrive, she didn't think Sissy was capable of raising them properly.
When Sissy gave birth to a daughter in
Is this Sissy's basic?
1855, the baby was
I always
quickly
thought
snatched away by
Sissy's basic and
governesses
Kevin's
Sophie
basic
had
are
chosen.
Why?
The same thing happened with their second daughter
One's
a
last
year
name is
later.
Basic and the other is
Sissy
Basic.
begged her husband to intercede on her behalf.
It's not like if your
Finally,
names sound
when the
alike,
elder daughter, named
you're
Sophie
related.
after her grandmother,
Though, is
was
Mr.
2
and
years
Mrs. T,
old, and her
that's not
sister,
Mr. T in it.
Gisela,
But one
was
day,
10
I want
months
him to
old.
own that company.
Sissy
Whatever that
managed to
fucking
pry them from their grandmother's clutches. She and
tomato
Franz
juice company
Josef
is that
took
makes
the
fucking
girls
Bloody
on her
Mary.
first
I
of
want that.
many
I want
trips
Mr.
to
T to own
Hungary.
that company.
But the trip
But it's
was
not the same as
short-lived. Both of the
Really?
girls became
Not to my
violently
knowledge.
ill,
But boy, if he was, he's not
possibly with
promoting it.
typhus.
Really?
The baby
I pay
Gisela
food.
recovered.
Drinking oregano.
Little Sophie
Bloody
died
Mary.
in her mother's
I
arms.
pay food.
It was a heartbreaking loss, made worse
Why?
by Sissy's
Why would
bitterness
she do
towards
fool?
her
What
mother
other kind of
for keeping her
fucking
daughters away from her
Bloody
for
Mary
so
mix is
long.
there? I used to
Sophie
drink
was,
Mr.
of
and Mrs.
course,
T.
moved by the toddler's death, as she
It
too
was so
had
good. I
experienced something
just drink that
similar.
shit. I can drink
Nevertheless,
an entire
she
thing
continued
of Bloody
to
Mary
press
mix,
Sissy
like
for a male heir.
a
The
gallon of
following
it.
year, Sophie finally got what she desired.
Pretty easy.
On August
Really?
21st,
I love that shit.
1858, 3 days
It's very
after Franz
interesting to me.
Josef's 28th
My father
birthday, Sissy gave birth to a son, a crown prince
spicy
Rudolph.
stuff.
The
We never had
hopes of the
Tabasco.
family
We never had
and the
sriracha.
empire
We never
were
had
pinned on the new baby. But Franz Josef
even
was
like
far
pepper.
too occupied with affairs of
hates
the state to be much of a father.
Why?
And as the
Because
second
he grew up
half
within the
of
city limits of the
19th
city of
century
Chicago,
proceeded,
which
all
is not.
dangers
It didn't really
reemerged
have any.
again
I don't want to say it didn't have spice.
instability
Sure, you
of
have
the empire.
European immigrants with fucking
Coming up, the Austrian
paprika and stuff
Empire
like that,
suffers
but that's
more
different
embarrassing
than
loss
like
and transforms into a dual
pepper.
monarchy.
And my dad was so
Every so often, something so impactful happens. It has the power to
cautious about
capture
it.
the
He
attention
wouldn't
of a whole
eat
country.
green peppers.
An event
Green
so
peppers
deadly
taste like,
or dumbfounding, it has
I
no
don't know.
choice but
They're
to
as
live
spicy
on
as like
in
cucumbers. There's like
infamy.
nothing to them. They're
Hi,
sweet.
Parcasters. It's
And yet
Ashley
he would
Flowers,
stay
and
with
I'm
them.
exposing the most
He would
sinister
eat them like
pieces
once
from
he
the
trusted
darkest
them if it
corners
was
of the
years and
globe
years, but he
in
did
my
not
new
like
True
spicy.
Crime Limited
Why?
series, International
I just
Infamy.
don't know why. So we never had
Every
anything
Tuesday,
spicy.
come along as I
So my
guide you on a
spice
wicked
profile
world tour.
is very
15
bland.
different countries,
And
15
when I have
infamous
anything
crimes.
spicy, it's like
Take a trip to
it's very
Iceland, where
spicy to me
6 people confessed to
because
a
I'm not
murder
used
that
to it.
never actually
And
happened. Journey to Mexico, where a lucha
so
libre
what?
wrestler
His spice
moonlights as a
profile?
serial
Spice
killer.
channel is a thing.
And travel
Really?
to New Zealand, where 2 friends hatch a deadly plan to become famous.
Anyway,
Each episode of International Infamy explores the
why?
twists and turns of a
This is every
notoriously
little boy's
high-profile
argument when
case,
I'm like
zeroing in on the cultural details which make the crime unique to its location, and explaining why it couldn't
89.
have happened anywhere
It'd
else.
be like,
Follow my new Spotify original from Parcast, International Infamy with Ashley Flowers, and catch a new episode every week. Listen free on Spotify or wherever you get
I'm
your
better than you are at
podcasts.
basketball. Kid be like, oh yeah? Well, I got a nicer bike than you do.
Now, back to
Oh
the
yeah?
story.
Well, we have a nicer car than you do. Well, I got a nicer house than you do.
By the late
Oh, yeah,
1850s,
well,
as he approached age 30, Franz Josef was married and
my
had sired
stepdad
a
can
son,
get Spice Channel.
promising
And
a
that was
legacy
like a
beyond
fucking,
him.
that topped
But in
everyone.
spite of economic
Really?
and social progress, the empire was still dogged
Really?
by
Yeah.
civil unrest.
Why?
For as long as Franz Josef had been on the throne, the assorted states of Italy had been attempting to unify under a single flag. This set the backdrop for the Second Italian War of Independence, a renewed effort to sever Italian lands from the Austrian Empire.
In 1858,
Really? Yeah.
Count Cavour, the leader of the Italian state of Piedmont, struck a deal with Napoleon III of France. It was agreed that France would come to Italy's aid if the Austrian Empire attacked Piedmont.
When we grew up,
Franz
we
Josef
had
could not take
most
this
everyone
lying down.
came from
On
two-parent
April
home.
26, 1859,
It was
Austria
very white.
declared war on
I think my
Piedmont.
kindergarten
In
class,
response, following
one
their
of them
pact,
either
France
maybe morning or
declared war
afternoon,
on
but I think
Austria.
afternoon. And I
Attempting
could be
to
wrong, maybe
recreate
one,
his
but
triumph at
every
Santa
kid
Lucia a decade
had
earlier,
two-parent
Franz
family.
Josef himself led the charge in the
My
Battle of
recollection, every kid was white.
Solferino
That did not
June.
change. That
But the
changed.
Austrian troops were outmatched by the
Maybe
combined
I could be
forces of
wrong
the
on that.
French
There
and
was somebody
Sardinians.
who like
The
identifies
Austrian
as something now,
military
but then
retreated,
it was all
licking
white
its
and
wounds.
Less than a
there was
month
nothing else.
later,
If you were, there were no
war was
Asian kids.
over. Austria had
There
lost
wasn't an
and
Asian
was
kid in
forced
that
to give
school.
up the territory
James
of
Moore, I think, is
Lombardy,
the first name.
followed by other parts of
And
Italy in the coming
Really?
years, when Italy
Yep.
would finally become
No other
united.
Asian kids. We had a Middle Eastern kid who did the facade.
In his first year as
So,
emperor, Franz
But aside
Josef had
from that,
asserted himself militarily
not
and
just no, we had a
diplomatically.
couple other kids from Middle East.
Now
I mean, he
he
was
had
from like
made himself
Riyadh.
seem incompetent in both
Saudi
regards.
Arabia.
Adding insult to injury, his failure
Anything
added
else?
to the country's financial troubles,
No,
setting the stage
that's another
for a
thing too.
series of
If you hear these
constitutional
names as a little kid,
reforms.
they don't seem
For
weird to you.
all its
I say
early
Khalil Abu Khalid all
successes,
the time. My mom said
Franz
Khalil Abu Khalid all the
Josef's
time. My dad
had
said
grown
Khalil
so
Abu Khalid all the time.
inefficient that it
And it
threatened
just
to
became a
collapse
thing.
the economy.
But when we
His
first met these
financial
people, it was
policies
like,
created such problems that in 1859,
it was
the
like
National Bank stopped accepting Austrian
Really?
currency.
Private
actually wasn't that bad
emerged to grease the wheels
because
of commerce.
I heard my mom
But
say
the
it
heads
enough,
of the banks
and my
were
mom
sick of
heard
being subjected
Mrs.
to the
Pod say it
emperor's
enough
army of
that it was like, but
bureaucrats.
it was even new
They
for
demanded
what's
a
up with her?
constitution and oversight from a
Her
democratically
dad's
elected
friends with Jack
parliament,
Kemp.
and they'd
Abu
spend
was
lending
not.
money until they got it.
I would just say
To
that's not
assuage
the
the
name that
bankers,
she
Franz
dreamt up
Josef
as a little girl.
reinstated the Reichsrat, an
But it
imperial
means
council that eventually
Khalil
turned
was friend.
into a parliament. The authority of the newly revived parliament was confirmed by a new constitution in February of 1861.
For the first dozen years of his reign, Franz Josef had resisted instituting a constitution. In the end, it was neither chanting protesters nor rifle-wielding revolutionaries that forced him to bend, but a gaggle of disgruntled bankers.
But taming the disruptions at home did nothing to calm the empire's foreign enemies. In 1866, Franz Josef found himself at war again, this time on two fronts.
The Kingdom of Prussia had been striving for years to unite the 39 sovereign states of Germany under one banner. However, Prussia's central role in the effort put them in conflict with the Austrian Empire.
Culturally, the leaders of Austria were deeply linked to its German territories. German was the Habsburg tongue and the language of the state government. If anyone was going to be at the center of a German unification, Franz Josef thought it ought to
So
be
his name is
himself.
friend.
But the emperor found himself strategically outmatched by the Prussians, in particular the kingdom's brilliant prime minister,
I used to spend
Otto
all kinds
von
of time at their house.
Bismarck. Years
And their
earlier,
grandparents'
he
house.
had announced that he
So I know,
was
I don't want to say I
seeking
know all
any
about
pretext to
Lebanon,
go to war with
but
Austria,
I know
and it was a
I know
fight
more about
he
Lebanon,
meant to win.
Lebanese
To that
people, I would
end,
say,
he
than
contrived an alliance with Italy. If Franz Josef opposed Russia's activities in Germany,
a lot of
he
people,
would
probably
find
more
himself
than
simultaneously at war with Italy to the
some
south.
Lebanese people.
It turned out
Really?
exactly as
Yeah, because
Bismarck
some
had
Lebanese
planned.
people don't even
During the 7 Weeks' War of
I don't think
1866, Austrian forces won a few encounters on the
Would you
Italian
like to
front,
touch another
but
story?
lost
Whatever they
resoundingly
made
to the
was
Prussians.
not my cup
The
of tea,
defeat
perhaps.
was
Why? Because it was
humiliating
just
and
different. If it didn't
decisive.
fucking come on a dollar menu
Austria's
or
claims
say
in Germany were
a
forfeited,
value meal,
and Franz Josef lost any
so
hope he
to
still
change my
harbored
palate is
of winning the German
but I
crown.
tried it. But here's
The
the thing:
writing
their own
was
kids
on
didn't
the
like it.
wall.
Their own
The
grandkids. I'd be
Habsburg
like,
dynasty
"What do we have?
was no
What are
longer
what
the
your
dominant
grandparents say
force
they're
it
making?"
once had
And he's
been.
like, "Oh, it's called blah blah blah," and I'm like,
Now,
"Oh, what is that?"
36
He's
years
like,
old,
"Oh, it's like."
Franz Josef was no longer the young conqueror who
It's
had
not
risen to the throne as a
And I
teenager.
was like, "Oh,
At
well, then
every
why are they
step,
making
he
like they really
failed to
like
live
it?"
up to his
But
early
it's not
promise.
very good.
And there were factions
And
within
so
the
that's the
empire
kind of buildup I
eager
had
to
on this
exploit
fucking
his
meal.
weakness.
It's like, oh,
Although Hungary comprised a large
Really?
portion of the
it was
Austrian
like
Empire,
we're used to sugar and shit,
geographically
and
and in
it's like
terms of population, the
it was like
nation had
plain
never fully
Middle Eastern.
assimilated.
Really,
Almost
yeah.
20
But it
years
wasn't
after
like
the
it wasn't
unsuccessful
bad. It was
revolution of
just
1849,
different, is what it
many
was. That's how I
Hungarians
described it. The
still
new
longed for independence.
By the
experience.
mid-1860s,
And then what happened?
prominent leaders began to renew their
His
calls for a
grandparents saw
new
that we did not
constitution and an independent Hungarian parliament. Franz Josef had to
didn't like it,
respond
then
or risk another rebellion.
The Austrian military was so depleted after its campaigns in Italy and Germany
really,
that the emperor was reluctant to take up
it's like the
another
time my
fight.
family went for
After years of contempt for Hungary, Franz Josef was at last ready to
He was my
bargain.
friend Heinz.
Diplomatic aid came in an unexpected form.
And
The
when we would go,
emperor's wife.
usually it was like a
During
new
her
place,
many trips to
but it
Hungary,
was like
Empress Sissi had
American.
become
This
something
was
of a
Japanese.
celebrity, as beloved in the country as most of the Habsburgs were reviled.
It was just
Sissi had also become acquainted with the nation's power
I
brokers.
remember
She
we
set
sat
up a
down
series of meetings between her husband and two
and
prominent
we were gonna
figures,
we ordered
telling
drinks.
him by letter exactly what he
My
ought to
dad
say
saw
to
the
them.
menu,
With her
stuff,
help,
not
they
the
arrived at a
prices,
deal.
stuff. And he's like, I don't like any of this stuff.
On February 8, 1867, the emperor and representatives from Hungary
What did we
officially
have? We had
adopted
some
the
stuff. My dad
Austro-Hungarian
ordered some
compromise.
things. What?
The
I
compact
don't know, because my
transformed
friend
the Austrian
was like, it's not,
Empire
it's
into the
okay, it's not,
Austro-Hungarian
he was like, it's
Empire,
good, it's
or
not,
simply
um,
Austria-Hungary.
but it's not like,
It was
it
now
was
a
new to
dual
us.
monarchy,
And so we didn't
with Franz
necessarily,
Josef reigning as Emperor of Austria
we
and
like to
adopting a new title of King of Hungary.
course, we paid
The
everything, but it
compromise
was like,
afforded Hungary an independent
and now
parliament
going
and government.
and
Hungary would effectively function
going
as
to
its own state
right next
while
door.
keeping a diplomatic union with
Well,
Austria
they
in
have like
foreign
puffer
affairs.
fish and shit.
It was
My
a
father's
bitter
not
pill
gonna get
for
full
many
on puffer.
parties to swallow. Ethnic Hungarians in particular saw the compromise as a betrayal of their efforts for independence. But any concerns Franz Josef had about the deal were soon overshadowed by far bigger problems for his empire.
In 1871, the German unification was complete, with Austria left out of the picture. 2 years later, Franz Josef joined the League of Three Emperors with Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany and Tsar Alexander II.
The puppet master of the operation was German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He arranged the alliance to ensure peace between the empires and to promote his own country's emergence as an international power. Though he didn't yet realize it, Emperor Franz Josef was already a relic of an obsolete era, being used as a tool by savvier leaders.
Throughout the 1870s, Franz Josef withdrew more and more into his routines. He rose every morning at 4 and was at his desk shortly after. Once there, he spent the day perusing documents, fueled by coffee and cigarettes.
His advisors prepared special doctored versions of the newspapers for the emperor, redacting anything that might upset him. He was constantly surrounded by servants and advisors, but had no real companions. As an anonymous member of his inner circle put it, our emperor has not a single friend.
Man.
He stands utterly alone.
His marriage to Sissy grew increasingly cool as well.
Having
Having discharged her duty by giving the emperor a son, she kept her own routine.
She dieted and exercised vigorously and took up the habit of chain smoking and writing poems. She also continued her frequent and extravagant vacations to Hungary and the Mediterranean, once even picking up a tattoo.
To fill the gap left by his wife, Franz Josef began taking mistresses. These relationships were purely physical, but in 1885, at the age of 55, Franz Josef began seeing an actress named Katharina Schrott. Their fling blossomed into the closest companionship of his adult life.
Sissy not only knew about the affair, she encouraged it. Though she never felt any passion for her husband, she remained loyal to him and didn't wish to stand in the way of his happiness.
Soon enough, however, fate would destroy the happiness of the whole family. One sensational tragedy would wrap them up in an international scandal.
Coming up, Franz Josef suffers one tragedy after another. Now back to the story.
By the late 1880s, Franz Josef I, almost 60 years old, was firmly entrenched in the routines and rituals of running his dual monarchy. While the empire had suffered repeated shocks from within and without, he had managed to hold the state and his family together for almost 40 years.
Like, kind of the most beautiful part of that book is she really did read it from someone who really had those kind of connections and would later on make an entire brochure out here with that in his mind. I mean, and when I was reading it, it was like I was longing for it so badly that you really, like, now she really does have a book. Like, at the time, it was, I would just say it was like pretty quick of me to do. But now she really does have what she wanted, which is someone who is even better, somebody who read it and moved out there like that. Again, after failures.
Were invested in Rudolph. He was groomed from an early age to lead, just as his father had been.
But Franz Josef was far busier and more emotionally distant than his own father. And Sissy, still traumatized by the loss of her eldest child, was not as attentive as Archduchess Sophie had been with Franzi and his brothers.
Rudolph's upbringing fell largely to a string of caretakers and tutors, in addition to Archduchess Sophie, who really cared about the boy's upbringing.
From an earlier age, the Crown Prince showed signs of what we would probably diagnose today as anxiety. In his 20s, he was routinely sick and began drinking heavily, often combining the alcohol with morphine. To top everything off, his marriage was not going well, and he often turned to other women to fill his time.
Franz Josef was insensitive to his son's difficulties. He expected the young man to buck up and rise to his responsibilities. But Rudolph's demons continued to haunt him.
To where you've ever been, that's the most
Rudolph became
underappreciated.
fixated on the idea of forming the
There are
suicide
some that I
pact.
feel are
He
appreciated.
wanted to
Like,
watch die before taking his own life. He suggested the idea to his wife, as well as to his longtime mistress,
fucking
Mitzi
city,
Kaspar.
and
They
no one
both
knows
turned
about
him
it.
down,
It is
thinking the request was a joke.
It
He
is like
finally found a willing
perfect area.
prospect in a
Nothing ever
17-year-old
bad happens.
baroness named Mary Betzera, with whom he had a
It's so
month-long
nice,
tryst
and
beginning in the fall
it's
of
very
1888.
middle class. It's
On the
probably
evening of
middle to
January
low class.
29th, 1889, Rudolph and Mary sat together in his room at the hunting lodge.